report on this. Great. And I'm going to hand it over to my lovely Uncle Noel Blair. Yeah, they can hear you.
Welcome everybody to the special activity. I know it's something to do with Bonyi, and I believe it's tracking in where they come from, where they go, and it looks after them. Now, it's so interesting to find out that one of them kind of we have a couple of people, people coming back on the answers where they come from, where they go, and where they really started. I think it's interesting. I think I said the right thing. It's an interesting project. It's one that said to identify some strange happenings, I suppose, all the supernatural stuff that the monuments are used to. If you're not sure, they do represent some supernatural stuff. So be careful when you investigation and where you go to. It's very important that you identify where you come from and make sure that you respect what you're doing and ensure that you're doing it for the right reasons and for the right people, for the right people. So good luck to you, the team that's involved, and help everybody that you can do it. So thank you for that.
Were you able to hear much of that? A little bit, yeah. Sorry about that, but yeah.
Do you want to repeat anything?
No, it's okay. It's everyone in the room heard him, so we apologise. The Parkinson's makes the voice a bit husky and quiet, so unless he's really hungry, that's as loud as he gets.
That's what I mean, Bonyi nuts.
All right.
We might just kick the yarn off, eh?
Yeah, hand it.
We'll let you take over, Patty. Sorry, Patrick.
No, that's all right. Thank you. What a great welcome. Thank you, Uncle Noel. First off, I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Patrick Cooke. I'm a Gunggalida man from up in the Gulf country. We've also got Monica Fahey and Dr. Emily Enns as well, a part of the Retracing the Ancient and Colonial Dispersal of the Bonyi and from the First Nations people project. First off, what I'd like to do is pretty much acknowledge whose land we are speaking on today, and then Jinibara. And also, I'd like to acknowledge all of the groups that we've actually been working with along the Bonyi story as well. And that's the Yalanji, Mullerigi, Mamu, Girigan, up in the north, around the Cairns area, Gurang Gurang, Batala, Waka Waka, Gubbi Gubbi, Yugara, Turrbal, Yugunbi, Bunjalung, and Githabul Mob. So there's more groups out there too as well. However, yeah, these are the main ones we've been talking to at this point in time. Again, thank you for letting us have a yarn today and just a bit of a talk around our project. I might hand it over to Dr. Emily Enns to have a bit of a chat to you around where it all stemmed from and what our projects were about.
Yeah, how are you going? I've just got to acknowledge that I'm on the Gamaragal, land of the Gamaragal mob down in Sydney. Thanks for allowing us to come and talk to you today. This project really stemmed from a bit of a conversation I had with Maurizio Rossetto from the Sydney Botanic Gardens a few years ago. He was telling me about some research he was doing on the genetics of rainforest trees on the east coast of Australia, and that there was some interesting patterns and I guess sort of genetic connections between some species and some that he really couldn't explain using standard sort of Western scientific techniques. And we sort of started to yarn a bit more, and because of my research I've been doing in Ireland with some of the mob up there, we talked about the possibility of pre-colonial Aboriginal dispersal of some of these trees as possibly explaining some of the disjunct populations that we're seeing of these species. So, for example, like bunya pine, you might know that you've got a lot of them down there around where you are right now on Jinibara Country, around southeast Queensland into northern New South Wales. But there's also a population up there in northern Queensland. So I guess the question sort of started to arise, well, are these populations connected? How are they connected? And are the Aboriginal communities associated with these trees, are they also somehow connected through cultural stories, language, and all that kind of stuff? So the question started to flow. We started with a bit of a pilot there with our colleague Oliver Costello. He's a Bundjalung man. Want to acknowledge Oliver. We started the investigation with the black bean. First off, he has an association with black bean himself, and we looked at some of the stories around black bean in northern New South Wales, and Maurizio did some sort of initial genetic explorations into the black bean, and we found that some of the black bean, with the genetics, you're looking at sort of how the families of these trees, how they're sort of related and how they're different, and found that there was some, couldn't explain some of the black beans that were up on top of some of the hills as well, and how did they get there when usually the black bean is dispersed by water. We did this initial investigation with Ollie and found that, there were a lot of stories about Aboriginal people before colonisation moving the trees along like walking tracks, and the genetics that Maurizio was doing matched the cultural stories. So this was the first sort of investigation we did. Then we got a big grant to kind of further explore these questions and include the bunya nut and black walnut into the research. Unfortunately, this project has been significantly impacted by COVID over the last couple of years. We haven't really made the progress that we wanted to today, but we have found some pretty interesting stories. And we're fortunate that Patrick Cooke and Monica Fahey put their hands up to do PhD research on the topics as well. And they're going to tell you about the details of their research, what they've done so far, particularly around bunya nut, as this is, celebrating the Bonyi there with your exhibition. So I'll stop rambling on now and hand you back over to Patrick.
No worries. Thanks for that, Em. So one of the questions was retracing the plant dispersal with biocultural knowledge and distinguishing between the natural or human dispersal requires input from Aboriginal knowledge holders and knowledge custodians. So what we're after there is basically asking for the stories or what's around the bunyas and talking around where those locations were found. So first off, what we had to do was actually find where the bunya trees were and how did we go about that to do that. So I'm not sure, it's more around the Australian Living Atlas data cleansing of the bunya pines. I'm not quite sure if many people have seen what that is or what that site is. What it is it's an open access site at the end of the day. It's on the Australia's biodiversity data around that. So if you go onto this site and you just type in bunya pines along those lines, what will happen is it'll come up with your, no, it didn't come up this time. Sorry. Bunya pine. Sorry. There we go. A Crello Bidwilly hook. So basically there's your bunya pine. So what we did was then we actually clicked on that to see where the locations throughout Australia, where the bunyas were found. But as you click on the view interactive map as we go along to cleanse the data, what we found was it was found pretty much all over the world. So see all the blue dots. These are recorded on the sites within there. So that's pretty much how did we go about cleansing that down, all these different sites within that framework. So what I did was I actually followed a process of searching through the ALA, clicking through that and did these 3 steps of cleansing it from occurrence, when did it occur and what years and what decades, where's the locations and where were the bunya pines actually found, using those lines. and coming down that step 2. And step 3 was around the attributes, around that. Where were they found in that area? So what we ended up finding was, after cleansing all of those 564 records across New Zealand, across the world at the end of the day, we came up with about 26 sites where we found the bunyas along those, around those areas. That's after using that. So when I went from there is saying, well, okay, we went from all of these bunyas to down to these sites here. So then I needed to know what groups were around that area. So having a look at where, through the National Native Title Tribunal, talking to those guys, talking to yarning with locals and mob and other traditional owners around the country, came up with these names, and they said, oh, look, you might need to go and talk to these groups around that. They might have some interesting stories or have some knowledge around the bunya pines around that. So up in the north, we found these 2 sites, and we come across the Yallanji, Mulluridji, Mamu and Girrigan mob. Down the southeast corner, around Brisbane, up around the Blackwall Ranges and Bunya Mountains, we came across the Gurain, Butchalo, Waka Waka, Gubbi Gubbi, Yugara, Turrbal, Yugambeh, Bunjalung and Githable, around those guys. So then what happened is then we actually went into the research around that, and we then said, well, we need to come up with a set of protocols to work within that framework of all of those different groups within there. So we set up a protocol layers, so like an onion effect. So the research question was at the central part of it, and we had the research around that. What protocols within this framework did we actually work with? Which means me as an insider and outsider, as an Indigenous person. So what that meant was, as an insider, I already had connections to groups and mobs that I could talk to. As an outsider, I was going into groups as an Indigenous person and talking to them about my history. So we used these different layers to unpack the protocols within that framework, which was very interesting. So we've got the protocols undertaken. We've talked to mobs. We're starting to do that. I needed to find a little bit of literature now around it and what that looked like. So there was I came across probably around about 110 to probably 160 odd different articles, publications along the way. A lot of those referred to Indigenous groups within that. So this is some of these guys that had references, or groups that had references to the literature pertaining to the bunya pine. So they could be news articles, they could be publications, they could be books. From the literature, then basically what we did then is I pulled together another map of connecting the literature and the people to the bunya and the bunya story in that sense. So from the literature around here, from Morwood's work, from the cosmology processes, so the guys that walk along the stars, follow the stars up to the Bunya Mountains, we had all of these other different groups that are actually coming up throughout the literature saying that they came to all these great festivals for the bunyas, and that some of the knowledge holders told us about how they walked up through the different areas, and coming from, say, like Gadigal country down here, they walked up to the Bunya Mountains. So that's some of the knowledge or some of the stories that were told around that. So breaking that sort of literature down, we then worked around some archaeological sites and campsites around where the bunyas were located. And you could see where this is the red sign, here is the pathway. So that's part of the literature, came out of the literature. The campsites were out of the literature too. So under GIS, Geographical Information System, this is how I overlaid the map within that framework and then put the bunyas on top. So you can see how the bunya from the ALA came about, the pathways there, and so the groups and that. So which told a bit of a story then around, was there bunya and bunya connections? I've got some photos here of just around the old Cherbourg mission in 1907. In the background, you can see a bunya tree, a couple of them around that. So what we had was mob, after they were removed from country too, as well. What it was showing was that it was actually, the mob actually took it back to, if they were on missions, that they planted it there. This is on Mullimbah-dja mission down around on Gadigal country, down on the northern New South Wales area. There's a big old bunya tree there beside the church. So mob were actually still planting them in hidden knowledge to other to other areas, or where people were moved on, so they could actually keep practicing what they were using. Also, what we found too as well is, like Kenwood Station back in 1907 here, this is the old homestead at Kenwood Station. It had bunya trees there. And we know from evidence that Aboriginal people used to camp around there. There's still that big connection back to Kenwood Station too as well around, even today, there's still bunya plants being planted around there too as well. There's old bunyas there as well. So we've still got that whole connection from the literature, from the stories, from old photos to everything around that, saying, hey, Aboriginal people did move them around. They did take them to their places. There's locations that they've found through the literature as well as old stories. There's still that whole connection stories and creation stories that you have, which is fantastic around the bunyas. So I think I might move on now to Monica and see, and I'll stop sharing my screen and let Monica share hers, hey? Around the genetics, and let's see if we connect it up with the genetic side of things.
Okay, can everyone see and hear? Okay, there we go. Okay, hi everyone. I'll start by outlining some of the factors that influence the distribution of bunya and the impact that this has on its genetic patterns. So first, the availability of habitat has shifted through time due to climate change. So as the Australian continent moved away from the equator, the land got increasingly arid and more fire prone, and that led to significant rainforest contraction. So over the past 2.5 million years, there's been a cycle of glacial events, which led to a cycle of rainforest contraction and re-expansion. And the last glacial maximum, it peaked about 21,000 years ago and it ended about 12,000 years ago. That was a particularly harsh time for plant life with low water and low atmospheric carbon dioxide. And these habitat contraction and expansion events can leave a signal in the DNA of all species as populations become isolated from each other. And then they lose the ability to exchange genes. So also important is fruit size. It's very important for dispersal of rainforest trees and the ability for them to colonize new areas of suitable habitat when the climate becomes more hospitable. And so previous work by my supervisor, Maurizio Rossetto, and some of our colleagues at the Botanic Gardens, they've demonstrated that small fruited trees generally have a much broader distribution and greater genetic connectivity between their populations when you compare them to large fruited species. So for successful dispersal to happen, we need the fruit to be ingested whole so that the seed can be kept intact and then germinate after passing through the animal's gut. So this means that large fruited species like bunya or black bean would have been more sensitive to habitat loss after their megafauna disperses when extinct, sometime between 12 and 40,000 years ago. And then obviously we're most interested in the human use of these species. The time scale for this is unknown really, but the oldest evidence of culinary use of rainforest nuts dates to about 10,000 years ago, but that was in Papua New Guinea. In Australia, on the Australian continent, paleoecological records suggest that there was increased human occupation of rainforests about 5,000 years ago, and that nut processing on grinding stones increased 2,000 years ago. But these are based on a material record which is highly patchy. and it's possible that dispersal of large-fruited species by megafauna or by people, it could be much more ancient or more recent than these estimates would indicate. But it's still important for me to note in my work, because when we're trying to date Bunya dispersal events, it's much easier for us to attribute it to humans if we date it to a time after the megafauna went extinct. What is genomic data? We acquire it in 4 steps. First, we collect leaf samples from across the distribution of our study species. Ideally, we'd have 6 to 12 samples, or 6 to 12 individual trees at each site in order to capture the diversity at the site. The next step is to extract the DNA, and we grind up the leaves, usually in a mortar and pestle, add some enzymes that digest and chop up the DNA fragments. And here we're targeting, can you see my mouse? Yep. We're targeting these little green chloroplast DNA and nucleus DNA. So the chloroplast is the photosynthesizing organelle in a plant cell, and the nucleus is sort of the brain of the cell. And the chloroplast is a single-stranded intact genome, and the nuclear DNA is double-stranded and on chromosomes. We sequence these with a DNA sequencing machine, which essentially reads all of these nucleotides, the order that they occur in, and records them. So we call each of these nucleotides, A, G, T, and C, we call them alleles. And then for the last step, after sequencing is repeated a few times, we genotype the samples by recording the alleles. These are all of our samples over here, and these are all of the alleles on the top. When a nucleotide varies between samples, we call that a single nucleotide polymorphism, or a SNP for short. So these here are considered SNPs because the top row we've got an A, whereas the second 2 samples have a T instead. So genetic diversity and variation between samples is basically estimated from the number of SNPs that differentiate them. And we target these 2 different types of DNA because they give us different information. So chloroplast is single-stranded, it's maternally inherited, and so it doesn't really change through the process of reproduction. It just kind of goes intact from one generation to the next. That means it's really slow evolving and useful for dating really ancient divergences between lineages. So ancient that it would probably predate any human kind of timescale. And we sent our samples to Deakin University for sequencing, but unfortunately the technique wasn't suitable for Bunya, so that didn't work. But we did manage to get some SNP data, which we acquired from Diversity Arrays Technology in Canberra. The SNP data, as I said, is double-stranded, carrying both maternal and paternal DNA. And it's usually the random junk between genes rather than coding information. But it changes through sexual reproduction, and it's more prone to mutation than chloroplast DNA. So this higher mutation rate means that it's really useful to infer more recent or more localized dispersal events. And we can use it also to infer changes in population size through time. So we've kind of, the main question is, can we find an association between the Bunya gene flow and the cultural pathways that Patrick's work has revealed? So sorry, my map, I was having some technical difficulties when I made it, so it's not clear. You can't quite see all the sample sites, but the main thing to note is we've got 3 sites in the wet tropics, 2 in Mount Lewis and Kenwood, and down here is what I'll refer to as Southeast Queensland. We've got the Bunya Mountains in the west here, Mapleton State Forest near Maleny, where you guys are gathered up there, and Brisbane around here. We're primarily looking at gene flow within Southeast Queensland based on the work that Patrick's revealed, that there's seems to be a lot of connections within Southeast Queensland, but less so in the wet tropics. And we're retracing 2 threads. We're retracing the colonial era dispersal by Aboriginal workers as they come onto the homesteads and bring bunya with them, but also those more ancient dispersal associated with the bunya festivals and those dreaming stories. So here's some results so far. What we've got here is what you call a principal components analysis. All you need to really know is that the analysis divides the variation in a data set across different axes. This bottom one down here is the primary axis of variation. So 12.8% of the variation in the whole data set moves in this direction. And this is the second most important axis of variation with 4.7%. So already we can see there's some really clear differences between the 2 regions. Each dot represents an individual sample, and it's coloured by the sample site that it belongs to. We've got the 2 Mount Lewis sites up here and the Cannibalen site down here. So those are the wet tropics, Australian wet tropics sites. The main thing to note is that there's huge variation within the sites, but also between the sites. And you would expect this pattern with populations that have been around for a long time. They've been stable, so they've been able to maintain genetic diversity within the populations, but it also this large kind of gap between them means that they are quite genetically different, and so they haven't been exchanging genes also for quite some time. This contrasts with Southeast Queensland, which is essentially one homogenous population, which I don't often see in my work, so it's kind of cool to see that. But yeah, the main thing to note is that when all the samples are clustering together, it means that they're very genetically similar. Excuse me. So here is Southeast Queensland zoomed in. Sometimes it's good to subdivide your data and analyze regions separately to get a more finer scale investigation. So of note is number 5, that's Mapleton State Forest. It's clustering slightly separately from the main group. And we've got over here, we've got Bunya Mountain sites. And I think this is Budrum Farm, closer to the coast, to the Sunshine Coast. So although the variation overall is super low, 1.8 is nothing, but there is still a bit of fine scale structure within Southeast Queensland. This is the last figure I'll show you. So it's what you call like a genotype assignment test. Each bar represents the samples, and each row we've got K2 to 4. That is basically where the model is saying, if you assume that you have 2 gene pools overall, how do each sample, what's their genotype? or 3 genotypes or 4 genotypes. So figure A, which is all of our samples from Southeast Queensland, it's showing that regardless of how many gene pools you assume there are, each sample is basically the same. They've all got this kind of admixed genetic profile. So that's just one population. But when we, over here in figure B, I removed the colonial sites, the sites that we know were planted by Aboriginal people during at colonial sites. We do see a little bit of differentiation between the data sets. So K3 was the best supported model. And that's really cool because we can see Mapleton again is standing out. It's mostly got this yellow genotype, whereas the Bonyi Mountains are a bit more mixed. And that is interesting because it could relate to the fact that we know people were bringing bunya with them from their homelands to the Bonyi Mountains as part of those festivals. So what next? I need to sample more because, yeah, we had COVID disruptions. So in order to explore those really site-specific things, particularly with the colonial histories, we need to get some more sites in there. But with the data that I do have, I can use coalescent models to date migration or population expansion events, and hopefully they will be dated to a time after the megafauna extinction. So we would have 2 expectations: that Southeast Queensland underwent a rapid expansion, which is what happens when you have all of this excessive propagation happening. And also at colonial sites, you might see what you call a founder effect, which is the accumulation of very rare SNPs. If you bring a small amount of propagules from one location and take them to a new location, the gene pool is going to be very small, and so it has a distinct kind of genetic profile. And I've just shown a figure here of the coalescent model, which is basically retracing genealogies of genes within a sample, but then you kind of summarize that across your samples to make inferences about when did all of starting in the present day, you've got all your samples here, and you can date splits when they happened in the past. And finally, I guess another interesting thing that I'm hoping to look at is the association between black bean and bunya. Do they show similar patterns? Because I've found at a lot of the field sites that there's an association of the trees together. So these photos are in the Bonyi Mountains National Park, and we've got black bean in the foreground and bunya nut in the background. It's really cool to see black bean there because it's an upland site and there's no way that it could have moved up there through natural means. And these are some black bean pods and bunya leaves here too. So yeah, we shall see with more work. Okay, I'll leave it there. Shall I hand it back to you, Libby, to see if anyone has any questions that they want to ask?
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick and Monica. Yeah, we're really actually looking forward to continuing the relationship and see what we can continue to do with you in the near future. But I did mention there was the chat. I don't think anyone's put any questions in the chat yet, but if you want to put questions in the chat, yeah, but I have Gabrielle here. Maybe you could come into the screen and just ask the question. Okay. And introduce yourself too, maybe. Oh, hang on.
Hi, my name is Gabrielle Quackaloo, and my mom's Swahili, and
I'm quite passionate of the bunya cone distribution for a very long time. We've even had chats about it with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Mathematics Alliance when we've travelled interstate, and extremely interesting conversations. And if I'd have known this was happening, I would have invited another two fellas from Brisbane up who chat, who used, before COVID, we used to chat regularly on this exact topic. So I have a few questions. One is, when you were doing, the first big question I had that I wrote down is, how or what process do you use to confirm whether individual or groups of bunya trees that were pre-colonisation trees planted, what other processes do you use apart from literature and stories? Or are they the only processes you're using? What other processes do you use apart from literature and stories for the pre-colonising tree groups?
I think Patrick, he just messaged me his computer died, sorry, but he's trying to come back on.
That was for Patrick, that question.
Yeah, that's why I just thought I'd jump in. He's just trying to reconnect. His computer died. Yeah, he's jumping back on now, he's just said. Here he comes. I'll let him answer. Yeah.
Patrick, if you're here, we have a question for you. So
Can you hear?
yeah, can you hear us, Patrick?
He's just connecting to the audio now, I can see. Yeah, here he comes. Yeah. There he is.
All right. Patrick, this is Gabrielle. She just wanted to ask a question of you.
Hi, Patrick. Can you hear me? Can I just ask my other question? So I've got that. I had that question for Patrick, and then I had another question about the megafauna, and you were saying, and so my other sort of question connected into the megafauna is, and the dispersion of bunya plants is, with that, have you met with the mob at Mungo who have the megafauna cultural centre?
No, I haven't really. It's due to the fact of COVID kicking in for the last couple of years. It's really hard. I mean, this is one of the stumbling blocks we face with regards to it. But I'm happy to touch base with them if have they got much out there, or have they got stuff around the megafauna and uses of the bunya pine? Have you noticed any of that?
Well, I haven't. So I went there in like 96 or something, or 90, like in the mid 90s, and they had they were storytelling on a whole bunch of things, and plants and animals connected to megafauna, though, because they're like the only cultural hub that I've seen, I suppose, in mostly just the East Coast I've travelled, that are really consciously focusing on megafauna. And they had like big wombats, like big actual statues of wombats and kangaroos, and then they have mob just telling stories. And I just think that it would be a great conversation to bring up at Mumbo if you ever get a chance to go there, and just because it's a megafauna centre. And Patrick, while you're here, the other question I had that I'll just repeat, and this is a question that when I was working with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Maths Alliance, and we were working with a bunch of people coming in from all our First Nations STEM presenters, and we were coming in from pretty much all around Australia, though mostly the East Coast. And because one of the fellas, Mudjidi, he'd always ochre up, and his presentation was corroboreal equations, and he'd always ochre up with the bunya ochrings, which meant that every town, which was like 20 towns plus that we worked at, the conversation of bunyas would come up, and so oftentimes we'd then be taken to some big bunya tree in the place. And so understanding the dispersal of bunya cones was a very common topic that we used to talk about at these Indigenous youth STEM camps. So after listening to your presentation, my question is, how or what process did you use to confirm whether individual or groups of bunya trees that you're considering pre-colonisation planted, like how many, like were there any other processes apart from literature and stories that you used to identify pre-colonial planted bunya trees? And if you did, could you share some of those processes that were not literature or oral history?
Makes it difficult. No, thanks, Gabrielle. Look, I think one of the things that the process that we really followed was around that research protocol and how we actually went through that process. If that answers your question, sort of, I'm not quite sure what you're after there. I mean,
I know, so I can continue the next step of that question. So the next step of that question for me is then with the bunya cones that you're dataing as pre-colonisation planted individuals or groups of trees, were there also perhaps like the vines that they would use to climb the trees, were those plants growing near the plants that you consider to be pre-colonial planted? Were there were there vines growing near them?
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Look, were there other plants or other trees that were associated with the bunya or bunya pines or around those things? What we were really
specifically with the climbing of the bunya tree.
We didn't really drill down into that far into it around what vines we were using to specifically climb the tree. It was more so around the dispersal of the tree. What our research was after. Our research was basically around taking having the knowledge holders share some of their stories. And due to COVID, I couldn't get around to see everybody at that point in time. We've only got a very short window to write a PhD or a master's. And yeah, COVID really smashed us on that. But we did get around to talk to a few of the knowledge holders around there, around how were plants traversed, or were they transported, or were they planted at certain locations. That's what we were more so after, was more around the dispersal. Did they have any creation stories around that was linking towards it? Yes, there were some creation stories there. People talked around that. People talked around different ideas around how they process the bunya, different ideas how they obtain the bunyas. There was some people talked around you couldn't touch the trees at one part. Other parts they were saying, sorry, can you hear me?
Oh yeah, we can. We just missed that last end of that sentence.
Oh, at the end of that sentence, sorry.
Yeah.
So basically it was more around the dispersal of it. So basically people were sharing their knowledge around, look, they did touch the tree. Some people saying that they didn't touch the trees. They were sacred in certain areas. So this was gathering the knowledge around the trees in itself, around that pre-colonial perspective. That's why we were sort of seeing if there was any knowledge holders with that knowledge of how people actually dispersed it in the different ways, and the continual dispersal of it as well.
True.
So that there's that post and pre as well that needs to take into consideration. How knowledge is being shared today. I mean, there's bunya pine. A lot of people are actually writing a lot about bunya pines. There's a lot of literature around there. There's a lot of information around it. There's connecting through to pretty much a lot of the, what would you call it, the different sciences at the end of the day, write about this cosmology that's part of the bunya story now. There's actually the pathways and campsites, there's single posts or something along those lines, you know? There's all these different stories around the bunyas. So we're only just touching the top of it, yeah. If that makes sense, Gabrielle.
Yeah, it's a great project. And just
I just want to ask,
Yeah.
get some other people's questions.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
do you want to? Is this a
Oh, I
new
was just
question?
going to just mention
Yeah.
that through the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Max Alliance, that you'd probably find some very interesting information from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Max
Yeah.
Alliance as well.
Can say that.
Thank you.
Well, that was really, really good answer actually, because I was thinking when Gabrielle was asking that question, a couple of things. One, a lot of that other material actually is embedded in our storytelling and our own kind of, so that material is very present in the way that we hold our stories.
Yeah, I've been growing up around bunyas since
Yeah.
I've been little. So
And
I'm
all the
passionate.
excitement and passion is really good because you've got this one piece of this story, and by sharing it with us as an artist, and I know Joe Jeasons, who's in the room as well, is inspired by photographing Bonyi and Country, and it's good just to come together and have these moments to kind of cross all these amazing things that happen in our culture around this really significant plant. We have some questions in the chat. I'm gonna do my best to do this. So Hilary Pearl says this is,
Would you like me to ask this?
do you want to ask that, Hilary?
Yes, I will. I live on Dilkusha, by the way, and I noticed there was some data in Monica's tables from Dilkusha. So we live just upstream from Baroon Pocket and are very proud custodians of a lot of bunya trees. I'm just wondering, so I've got two questions. You know, the Baroon Pocket was apparently it's been flooded now, but it was apparently a meeting place. And I'm wondering if the genetic data would show up anything in that, like, you know, the fine scale in terms of trees actually growing in Baroon Pocket compared to ones as they are further away from there. And my second question was, I heard someone saying that there's some marker bunya trees through the Blackall Range, which kind of were planted to show the route through the Blackall Range. And I don't know if that's a rumour or if Monica or Patrick can know anything about that.
Shall I answer that first question? So you're asking if you can get information on specific sites about the origins of the trees, or if we can find evidence that Baroon was a meeting point. So one limitation to note with the bunya data set is that overall there's quite low genetic diversity. Like using the DART data on other species, I've had you know, up to 20,000 or even more SNPs, whereas unfortunately I only had about 6,000 SNPs to work with in the bunya. I think that's just because a lot of the DNA sequencing work, it's all often geared towards flowering plants, and bunya is a non-flowering plant, and because they're just very different diverged lineages, flowering and non-flowering plants, it means that they're genetically very, very different. So that low variation can make it harder to find site-specific genetic profiles. But we can use coalescent models to test really specific questions. So if you're interested in knowing about this, say, for instance, the Bunya Mountains, I pointed out that it had quite admixed genetic profiles. So we could test questions on whether that genetic mixture is because of migration from other specific sites. So we could go, okay, we've got the DNA over on the coast and somewhere further north, and test the likelihood of different migration models that can best explain the genetic variation in the sink population, which would be the Bonyi Mountains. But if there's no variation, it's kind of, there's not really, you're not going to get a strong signal of that dispersal history. But you're right that I've also heard about Baroon and around Maleny being an important meeting place. So that's why I got excited that Mapleton stood out as distinct. So I'm wondering if that was like a if that was sort of a hub of Bunya festivals, and it might have been distinct from the other Bunya festivals further west. Does that sort of answer some of your question? I've forgotten what the second question was. Oh yeah, the marker trees.
Marker trees.
Do you want to talk on that, Patrick? Or
Yeah. Look, we couldn't really say for certain if they were marker trees. I mean, I think if more research needs to be done on that, which would be another research project. However, within what we're actually doing with regards to dispersal, it could be in the way that they've used the trees. Knowledge holders might need to know around that too as well, if they use them as a marker tree significantly around that. Does that answer your question, Hilary, in a sense?
Patrick, is there evidence in other species or in other communities of marker trees being planted to designate routes?
Not that I'm aware of off the top of my head, Hilary. There were.
I think there are for some species.
Yep.
I found, like I said, I found Bunya and black bean together quite often, which is interesting because they're quite, ecologically different species, and they were often they were on those walking routes and near campsites. So it could be a bit of a chicken or egg question about whether trees there first or the campsites first, but yeah, you could find an association between species potentially.
Thank you. I just might quickly ask in the room if there was any questions. There's quite a few people here. You can't see them all. I haven't asked them if they want to be on camera or not. Is there any questions? Yeah.
About that last question. Cooke has done some work on Bunya trees as site markers and place markers. So if they've researched with Cooke online, his work on that.
Yeah, they have a very strong relationship with Ray. He was going to come today. But yeah, and
I guess I got one. Through ducking in and out, sorry, looking after Uncle. So I'm not sure if it's been answered yet or not. When you were talking about the genealogy of the Bunyas, and you had the map up and there was the red and yellow, and it looked like there was a various amount of different DNA ones up in the Bunya Mountains, up into Mumbo. So I was just wondering, is there a way to, or have you traced that back to, have they come from Baroon Pocket and expanded out from there?
Yeah, I just answered a question similar before that. We can use what you call coalescent models, which have very specific assumptions about under this scenario of moving propagules from, say, Baroon Pocket to Bunya Mountains, and you can see if the variation in the Bunya Mountains is what you would expect under certain dispersal scenarios. But you have to use very specific assumptions for those models, such as how many generations in the past, how big was the original population size, how many individuals kind of migrated over. So when we use these models, we kind of have to have a little bit of a grain of salt. So they're never, evolution is obviously a very complicated thing. So no model is ever going to be specific enough to match our questions, but we can compare different scenarios, say dispersal from this population A or population B or population C, and see which one makes the most sense with the genetic patterns that we can see today.
The DNA is the same, you just can't figure out which direction it's come from.
It's hard with the analyses that I've done so far. You can't infer the direction, but yeah, those coalescent models can assume directional migration. Yeah, so yeah, that's the kind of thing that I'm hoping to explore. It's just the only problem is that you need lots and lots of SNPs, and my data set doesn't have a huge amount of SNPs, but I'm sort of brainstorming some alternative ways to do that.
Does that mean you have to come up here, Monica? Spend a weekend or a few weeks?
So in my recordings, in my second grade uncle's recordings with LP Winterbotham, so Willie Mackenzie, Gadigal, I'm not sure if you referenced anything from there. I'm sure Ray would have. He stated that this was reported in 1950, that there was more bunya pines along the Stanley River than on the Bunya Mountains, which back then the Blackall Range was known as the Bunya Mountains, not so much up there at Toowoomba. So I think, it's I'm sort of poking and prodding there just to sort of not so much get to the bottom of it, but just get to, like you said, there's many assumptions and take everything with a grain of salt, but just from what he's documented, it states that the bunya nut gathering was always held at Baroon Pocket every 3 years. And then he also goes on to say that we, within our clan groups alone here on Jinibara Country, would host the bunya gatherings every year annually, but it was only on the bump year that it would go to Baroon Pocket and be hosted on our country up by Kabi. So, but yeah, then now with the Bunya Mountains being referred to as the Bunya Mountains, but knowing the history of it all, I guess just trying to find that timeline and get the stories lined up and factual, I guess, now that we've got better sciences so we can prove.
Yeah, I've heard various traditional owners talk about about those festivals further towards Baroon Pocket, and there does seem to be a bit of genetic distinctiveness at Dilkusha and Mapleton, which is in the Blackall Ranges. So that's exciting and promising, and I just think we need to sample more intensely in that area to see if that's a real pattern. And if we do get more genetic diversity in the Blackall Ranges, that would, to me, suggest that it was the original bigger population. So a large population tends to have a more genetic diversity than does a small population.
Do you use LiDAR at all to sort of get another idea of the age of them? Done by height?
LiDAR?
Yeah, that's the radar they shoot down to sort of get the canopy heights of the trees.
Do you mean like looking at aerial photos and?
Yeah, so obviously, Patrick, you can go on ground and physically look at them and get a rough estimate by how tall they are, but then LiDAR as well basically does a laser down from the satellite to show the canopy of the tree. So if there is a bunya pine amongst black beans and all other sorts of things, it obviously being so much higher in the canopy, the radar, obviously the lasers don't go down as far, so you get a better reading of the height, so you can get a better idea of where the tall older ones are as opposed to these new younger ones that are only 50 years old.
The trouble with LIDAR though is that it only really goes back to the 40s, we've found that it's really hard to tell the age of the trees, because some of them, like a property owner will say, I know exactly when that was planted and it's like quite old, but it'll be, to me, it would look like a young tree. And then you see these other really big trees that are apparently not as old.
Yeah.
That's probably the effect on environment and DNA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just conscious that we're at time, but we do have a few questions in the chat and a couple more in the room. Is everyone right to continue for a bit longer?
Yeah, I'm fine to continue.
I just wanted to make, there's a few. I wanted to pass it to our sister, Mia Hacker, who has asked a question. Would you like to ask that yourself, Mia?
Yeah, sure. Nara, everyone, how are you? All good? In particular for Monica or Patrick, but just acknowledging that I was privileged to be with Auntie Bev whilst Monica was doing some of her sampling. And hearing these results has got me questioning, when you were sampling and then extracting the DNA, you've primarily worked with the leaves on that. I'm wondering if the actual structural stem growth that the leaves grow on, if that was tested, and if you get different results from testing that which is growing directly out of the trunk. Is it strength difference or?
I'm not sure quite what you mean. Do you mean getting DNA from the trunk or?
Well, not from the trunk itself, because that wouldn't be good. But the samples that you took, the leaves were growing on the actual structural stem part. You weren't just cutting individual leaves off. So I'm wondering which part of those samples were actually tested.
Yeah, so I only used the actual leaf material. You can get from wood, you can get mitochondrial DNA, which it's similar to chloroplast in that it is a single-stranded whole genome, and it's also has the same benefits of dating older things. But it's just not often used. I don't know if that's because the extraction process is more difficult, but yeah, we get all the information we need from the leaf DNA alone.
Okay. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Mia. I wish you could be here.
Research.
I hope you're coming up this afternoon, Mia. Andrew Picconi, did you want to ask your question? And then we've got one question in the room as well after that.
Yeah, no, really great research, and thanks for the presentations this morning and for the invite to come along. I was really interested in like, I'm a conservationist, I'll just put that out there, but really interested in the heritage status of trees, particularly those planted at missions, because you know, in the post-colonial context, I would imagine that there would be a lot of value, cultural value, placed on a tree planted at a mission. And I often get concerned about the status of trees being chopped down for various things, but hopefully that there's some recognition of those trees in the Cultural Heritage Act. Was that at all sort of investigated, or do you think it's an important area for looking into? I guess that might be to Patrick or to anyone who has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I reckon, Andrew, that it should be part of that cultural heritage within that act. I don't think it's actually written into the Cultural Heritage Act at this point in time. They did have the Bunya legislation at one part of cutting down the trees. That was in the early stages. I'm not sure if they've retracted that or they haven't at this point in time, but from the stories and the knowledges, I think it could be a point that actually you could, as a conservationist, put it through the Cultural Heritage Act and from that point. So you can protect the trees even more outside of your national parks and that. So yeah. Does that answer your question, Andy?
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
And if anyone wants to work on that, I'd be happy to help.
Oh, it'd be awesome. And that's something we've also jumping in, but was one of the kind of motivators of this research as well. Like, you know, if we can show that these populations are not like just natural and occurred through climate, you know, shifting and stuff, but Aboriginal people deliberately planting, they're living cultural heritage, as you guys know, you know.
Yeah,
And it should be protected, every tree. Yeah.
we've got a lot of people in the room here, and also just want to acknowledge Annie Beverly Hand, who has done a lot of work in preserving culture and our stories around Bonyi. But one of the works in our exhibition by BJ is about the Bunya Proclamation, and he jokingly said to me, or he actually seriously said to me, and I thought he was joking, but I was missing the beat, that he's actually going to try and get that proclamation back in place, which you might want to just have a really quick yarn.
Well,
about.
just super quickly, because I know there's a lot of people, but yes, I am trying to. I've already mentioned it to a couple of the local government, just to plant that seed and get the ball rolling to let them know that I'm going to push for that. How that's going to pan out, I'm not too sure now, having the laws the way they are with private property and whatnot. Andrew, just to answer your question, by doing my bit, what I do is when I'm walking country, which I do a lot around here, there is a registry, because they freak out when you mention anything about heritage listing stuff, because then their property values and they can't make big, another stories and whatnot. They can't renovate, but that's it. That's it registry. So that's like basically you can go on there, and so I've come to learn from using that and yarning with them fellas. You can go on there and register. So if there is a nice big old bunny tree that may or may not have climbing grooves in it or anything, but if it's in a significant location and it's fairly old, I can actually GPS that and send that into them, and they will heritage list that and move. And it's not just the bunny pine, you occasionally get lucky and you'll stumble across, or through word of mouth and relationships and community, you'll hear about an old blackbud or an old gum tree that survived the felling days, from 1840, that's 6 people have got to hold hands around it. It's that big. So there's trees like that where there isn't anything really in place or stopping it from being cut down. So if I hear of stuff like that as well, I can list it on that data registry. And what that does is, if they ever, even if it is in parks or whatever, they want to put a walk through there or a mountain bike trail or whatever, it comes up on their maps with a little purple triangle, and then they have to come back to the TOs and discuss them, or with the native title body if they've got determination, to obviously, hey, let's move the track this way, or no, you can't do what you want to do there because of that tree or the significance of that location.
I'm happy for people to make comment on that. Sorry, BJ, if I'm rushing, I don't mean to. But there's Auntie Bev there in the background on the wall. As I move across to Spencer Shaw from Brush Turkey Enterprise, who has a question.
G'day guys, Spencer Shaw. We're facing, I don't know whether you guys are aware that we do have bunya dieback on the Blackall Range as well as the Bunya Mountains. It's been here for probably at least 2 years, if not a little bit longer than that. I've only just recently been made aware how long it's been on the Bunya Mountains, well over a decade, which is a hard thing to deal with when you see, we're going to obviously go through a loss of genetics as some of these big old trees die. We're not seeing too much in the forest areas yet. It's mainly the paddock trees and what have become garden trees that are dying at the moment. But it makes me think, like, we're planting as many as we can to try and counteract that and try and keep the genetic diversity there. I'm just wondering if the study tells us anything about any genetic bottlenecks on the bunya in the past, how they've fared over deep time, whether they've been to any dark places in the past where they've dropped into next to nothing and come back from that. So perhaps give us a little bit of hope in this dark place that we find ourselves at the moment. If that's a legible question.
Yeah, and that is actually, yeah, what is really cool about the data, because like I was showing that there's more diversity in the north than in the south. So those populations have obviously been really stable through time. So I'm kind of speculating that the populations in the south have lower diversity because they underwent what you would call a genetic bottleneck. So that happens often, like say in the last glacial maximum, for instance, it was not a good time for Bunya. And so the population might have shrunk down to like only a small gene pool. But then we can see that through dispersal by people, by First Nations people, that has boosted the genetic diversity. I didn't show all of the data because I didn't want to overwhelm you with genetics, but what we're seeing, another difference between the north and the south, is that the north has more SNPs, so unique SNPs at each site, but it actually has lower diversity measures. And so whereas the south has less SNPs but higher diversity than the north. So I'm speculating that a bottleneck would have reduced the gene pool, so there's less SNPs, but then through extensive propagation and dispersal, and then over a few generations, some of that genetic diversity is boosted. So that is actually like a really cool lesson for conservation genetics. And it's a thing that there's a lot in conservation or restoration. It's kind of, there's assumptions about more diversity must be good, but we don't really know that without experimentation. But we can also, get some history lessons through studying the impacts that First Nations people had on the flora and fauna in the past, because that's going down many generations in the future, and we can see what that does for the survival of populations. So I think, there is a bit of a hopeful story in the genetic data.
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome.
So just following on from that too as well, what we also found up in the north was there wasn't as much connection with the mob up there, with the trees, as much as what there is from down the south. What I mean by that is it was more so used as a food source, as just a bunya nut. At the end of the day, there's no creation stories that are tied to it up north. There's no languages linked to it too as well that I've found within my research at this point in time. So mob didn't move it around. There was no ceremonies attached to it as well, along those lines. So which is very, very interesting too as well, for where that, for the northern location too as well. And that might be a stagnant population too as well, compared to down south. Whereas down south along the Blackall Ranges and along the Bunya Mountains, along those lines, and you've got the creation stories linked to it and all these festivals tied to it, and so many thousands of people coming to these festivals, yet there's nothing really up north saying that they actually practice it in that way too as well. So.
Was Spencer still in the crowd there?
Yeah, Spencer's still here.
I just wonder, Spencer, some of your sampling that not sampling, the growing and planting of seeds to seedlings, are you able to use some of this data that Monica's done with the sample testing in a helpful way to just, decide what seeds you're going to harvest to then plant? To then replant into specific places?
Not as yet, but that would be good. I mean, these are new connections that we're making here, so it sounds like it'd be fantastic.
Awesome. Was there any other questions in the chat that I missed that anyone wanted to ask? We might just take 2 more questions. No? Anyone in the room? No, we might all be ready for what do they say?
Ready to eat some
A
bunnies.
comfort break. That's the new terminology I've been hearing. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think everybody's really enjoyed it. And there's a lot of artists in the room. And as you said, the sciences or whatever we want to call them, culturally, we don't kind of differentiate between that. But I know there'll be a lot of stories and ideas and people taking away from this and doing some pretty awesome things. So hopefully we can stay in contact. And yeah, and I can smell the fire outside for our amazing Cup Murray. We've got my cousin Kieran Anderson, the Kondamuka chef, who's just this morning put in the ground some beautiful ethically grown meat from our awesome partners on Jinibara Country. And so everybody is here to have a feed this afternoon. So if anybody's on there that is close by, you can come along and have a feed with us. Just bring your own plate, fork, and cup. And yeah, but thank you. Oh no, that was just more just being like, you know, sustainable. And like hopefully people will bring stuff and take it home with them. But thank you so much for that. That's excellent. Is there anything you wanted to say to finish off?
I'd just like to say thank you as well. And yeah, I look forward to catching up with you all. And Patrick, when you come up here, and
Yep.
we'll eat some bunions and go look at some bunions.
Sounds great. Thank you. Thank you for the
Awesome.
opportunity.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Awesome.
And this is recorded, so you can contact me if you want a copy, or we'll work around the ethics of that. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Cheers.
Country, Mum, see you.
All right. See ya. Bye.
It worked.
Hello. I'm just gonna scroll through these questions slowly. Oh, Uncle Noel has a question. He just woke up. Just so in case we need a copy of them, and I'm not sure that it saves it.
Thank you on behalf of Jinibara people. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Uncle.
All right.
And I just wanted to actually say that Jinibara crosses the 2 language groups of Gabi Gabi and Waka Waka. So
Yep.
it is mentioned in there amongst that. And Dala is another word for a Jinabaran mob. Hey, Uncle Noel, Dala.
Mm.
And it's, yeah.
That's like simulation.
Thank you again for the opportunities for letting us share our research.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thank you.
Awesome.
And we'll see you soon.
Sorry you can't make it. Bye.
Soon.
No worries. Bye.
Okay.